Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I'm Eric Johansson, a teacher with LSAT Demon. Joining me is one of my co-teachers, Brandon, who has not yet been on to share his LSAT success story, despite doing quite well on the LSAT. So we wanted to get into it. Brandon, thanks for joining.
Hey, Eric. Yeah, thanks for having me. Like Eric said, I'm a teacher with the Demon as well. I teach a Demon Foundations class on Sunday evenings, kind of like a intro class for people who are just starting out or in the beginning stage of their LSAT journey. So I really keep that in mind. I try to keep the class focused on those first steps and that. I also, if you also sometimes do a motivation class. I started doing that last month. I do it once a month, which is just an hour. We don't do any problems. It's just an hour of talking about how to study and how to stay motivated and all that. Because I think mindset is such a big part of the test. And I think most people at Demon would agree that it's basically it's step one in a way, right? You got to get your mindset right before you can even take those first steps.
Yeah, totally. Is that something that you worked on throughout your journey? Like, did your mindset or how you motivated yourself to study, did that evolve as you studied for the test?
I think I relied on my experience as a teacher a lot. So I just to say clearly too, I started out as a 155 diagnostic and I ended at a solid 180, which was amazing. Like
Very good.
my wife and I were on the road in the middle of Pennsylvania, at like a gas station, and I didn't even get an email from LSAC or anything because they had me on hold for like 3 weeks. So I just kept checking and checking, and I just went on LSAC and checked, didn't even get notified, and we just started screaming. It was it feels really good. Feels like a big accomplishment. So
Hell
really proud of
yeah.
that. But yeah, I think the biggest thing I relied on is my teaching experience. So I taught high school science for 7 years and just got kind of burnt on that. I could go into details, but I think a lot of people have at least a general idea of why teachers get burnt out
Yeah.
in the school system. I love teaching, I'm still doing it, but just not in working in schools. The administration and that kind of thing just made it really difficult. So I kept trying different versions and trying different schools, but eventually just decided to move on. So that's where I'm at now, going to law school and this kind of route. And so what I was getting at is my experience with that. I think, I did teach, I taught AP chemistry, I taught SAT, taught a lot of standardized testing. And as a teacher, I think, you're meant to stay positive 100% of the time, really. Like it's people compare it to acting. I mean, not like obviously not Hollywood acting, but you are acting in a way, right? In the sense
Yeah.
that you have an obligation to kind of put on a good face. And if you've got, BS going on at home, you kind of can't, it's not really good to bring that in the classroom. It's good to share some stuff about your life and not be, this husk of a robot person to your students. But still, the point being, there is a lot of positive framing and a lot of believing in my students, regardless. And even if you have a student who comes in your classroom and there's a 98% chance that they're going to end up with a C or a D at the end of the day, you still, try to get that student to an A and still, you know, say like, if you do this, this and this, like you can get there, and like always trying to think of new ways to help people improve and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I would tell my students, you can do this and basically have this mindset that anybody can succeed. It might be easier for some people than others, but there's always a path to succeed if you want it and if you have
Yeah.
the right tools and the right resources. I think the right tools and the right resources, that comes into play a lot too. I think a lot of people do have the motivation and the mindset, but don't have those. So you can tell I can talk about teaching and education
Sure.
for forever, basically.
No,
But
well, it's a big boon, and just it sounds like you've been a teacher in a variety of contexts. Were you public school?
so I taught 5 years in public schools in Michigan, a couple
Okay.
years in Detroit, and then Ypsilanti, which is like Renix and Arbor. And then I actually
Yeah.
taught 2 years in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia,
That's
at
right.
an international school. We talked about that a bit. And I know
Yeah.
you got an international school background too.
That's my parents' background, is they taught in international schools, and they were largely really great experiences. But I hear what you're saying about administration and just the politics of education, whether it's at a public school or a private school. The politics behind that, which I got a little bit of an insight into because my parents worked at the school. There is less of that being a teacher at LSAT Demon. Well, we can say that much. So I totally hear that. But despite all of those differences, and whether you're teaching the LSAT or high school science, whether you're at a public school or teaching online in Zoom classes, some of those fundamental tasks remain the same, specifically when it comes to hyping up your students. I'm reminded of, I was just watching of course, a running video, and this guy talked about his mantra as a coach, which he inherited from his coach, which was that athletes do not have equal ability, but they all have equal value. And how that's really crucial, I think, as a coach and also as a teacher, to know that even if our students are at different places, they are all equally valuable. Their journeys all have equal meaning. And if we as teachers can help along that path and help students find that value or see that value in themselves, I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I really like that. That resonates a lot with what I'm saying. And I think to turn that all on how that impacted me in my LSAT, I kind of was like, okay, if I tell my students this, I'm going to tell myself the same thing, And I I know it sounds a little crazy, but I basically sat down on day one. I was like, I'm gonna get a 180, and that was my goal. And part of it was like, I kind of I knew I didn't need it, and I knew that I could get into some great schools and get some great scholarships with less. But I set that as my goal just because I know that setting high expectations is so important, whether it be for yourself or for someone else. People tend to live up to the expectations you set. So if you set low expectations, people are going to live up to them. You know what I mean? And I was also kind of trying to prove something to myself, in that, what I tell my students is true. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. So like, I'm telling my students, you can do this and you can achieve this if you put in the time and put your effort in the right place. So I was kind of trying to prove that to myself. Like, okay, this mantra I have, I can see it through.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. So he called your shot with the 180, and you got that. I think it was your first test attempt.
It was my third.
Your third. Okay.
Yeah.
So talk about the journey of your progression of scores getting there.
Yeah. I guess I should probably give a little context with my study journey, which is not typically what we recommend. Still not necessarily what I recommend as a teacher. I took some time off teaching. So I basically took 6 months off, just didn't do anything, and kind of figured out what I wanted to do. Then I started tutoring part-time, doing some chemistry tutoring stuff. So for most of my studying, I wasn't really working, or I was just working a little bit. And I know that's different than most people, but so I kind of did cram a lot of hours into 3 to 5 months ish. And so I started studying end of November, did a few weeks, then, I had Christmas and kind of took that off. And then basically from January to maybe April, I was putting in a lot of hours. So the first test I took was February. And I think at that point, I'd just been studying a couple months. Like I said, I'd done a lot of hours, but I knew I hadn't studied enough to really get those like super high scores that I was going for. And, but still, still felt really good about it. 171 still very solid, right? And I took April, and then I took June. So I snuck it in before games went away. Because I did like the games a lot, and I'm kind of sad to see them go. I think they would have been really fun to teach. I'm sure you had some experience teaching them.
Yeah, I think it was mostly what I taught for the first couple of years. Loved the games, missed them dearly.
Yeah, that's okay though. So April, like, I walked away feeling really good. I felt like it could have been a 180 in the sense that I didn't. I think I didn't really have. I felt confident at the end of every section, and then June, same. I felt basically the same after April and after June. I felt confident. June, I did have one of the best LR sections I've ever had, where I got done with the LR and had enough time to basically click through the whole thing again, and just check everything. Like, I didn't flag a single question. I didn't go back and change anything. On RC, there was one question I found that I read something wrong, and I changed my answer. So I that
difference between a 179 and a 180.
I guess so, yeah. Like, just having that extra 2 minutes at the end.
Yeah.
Banked. And then, but games, I was like, usually I could finish games super early. In games, I was finishing up to last second. So I know people are always talking about, but I think I would just reiterate that it doesn't matter how fast you go, or, if you finish with 30 seconds left or 5 minutes left, it just matters you get every question right. So
Yeah.
I kind of did, especially when I was, towards the end of my studies, I did consider this, should I be like students talk about this, like whether you should be flagging something and coming back to it. And I mean, obviously, I would still obviously never skip a question, never leave it blank and come back to it. But I was deciding like, okay, maybe I stare at a question for 2 or 3 minutes just to make sure it's right versus, okay, maybe I have it 95 or even 85% confident that I flag it and come back to it intentionally. So I was kind of playing with this different stuff, but at the end of the day, I was just every question, just try to get it right the first time. And
Yeah.
that's what I ended up sticking with. That's, I think, what the demon preaches. So,
Yeah. It sounds like the experience or how you felt between like scoring a 171 and scoring a 180, both obviously excellent scores. I don't know if you noticed a difference in your approach. Sounds like maybe not, but is there something that, reflecting on it now, you can think of that separated 171 Brandon from 180 Brandon? Or if you want to go back and further and talk about like how you were doing in the 160s, like what separates that elite ability and that elite score?
I think a huge thing is volume. So I do have some tutoring students who are trying to push in the upper 170s. And I think the biggest thing, especially once you hit that 170 mark, and if you're just trying to push higher, the biggest thing is just volume. So another thing I said, like when I first sat down, just there's at the time there's 100 tests. With games, the numbers are different now. So there's whatever, 70 tests. I just said I was gonna do all of them basically,
Hmm.
and because I this also relying on my teaching background, it sounds it's kind of a sad fact about our education system, but especially when I was teaching British curriculum, which is very test focused. They take a lot of tests through high school, and that their entire college stuff is all based on their tests. So imagine if you just took junior, senior year, you took like 3 AP classes each 2 years, like equivalent to say, 3 2-year college classes,
Mm-hmm.
and you took a bunch of tests on them, and the students that would do well just did a shit ton of tests. Like
Mm.
you know what I mean? Like they just did every single past test that was available, and that was also kind of my experience. I was a STEM major, so biochemistry. I was just used to doing a lot of tests and that from that too. So all that being said, I was just like, with standardized testing, I tell my students this all the time. It's a pattern test. The questions are going to come up again in a different form. I've had some teaching moments. It's not always, it's usually hard to find ones that are super, super the same, but I have found a couple instances where like this question's about dogs and this question's about paintings, and they're the same exact question. They just,
Yeah.
I
Control
knew
left,
that.
change paintings to dogs, pretty much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I just knew from my experience and everything that if you do enough questions at a certain point, you've done everything they can possibly ask you. There's nothing new that they can even possibly come up with. So I think the biggest difference between 171 and, 174, 175 plus is just that volume, where I've just seen so many questions that nothing is a surprise.
Yeah.
And I noticed that like with the 171, like I didn't quite have enough time. I was still kind of unsure on some questions. There is definitely a level of I hit a point where I was 99% of the time just, yeah, that's the answer. Yeah, that's the answer. You know what I mean? And that just, like I said, just came from a ton of practice. Um, the 174 to the 180, I can say pretty fairly that I think a part of it was at least I remember my heart was kind of pounding, and I just kind of had that, you got that adrenaline and kind of speeds you up. And
Mm.
so I didn't notice, but I went faster. Like I can even remember, I want to say I finished maybe 7 minutes early on an LR section, which was
Wow.
abnormally fast. And I think that might have been part of the reason why I didn't, because at the time I was averaging like, I know this sounds crazy, but at the time I was averaging 178.
Yeah.
So I knew that that was kind of on the lower end for me at the moment. And I think going faster, sort of without realizing it, kind of might have been part of it. Yeah, by the end of it, I'd at least touched every test. I had done maybe with the old numbers, I'd done maybe 60 like full practice tests, and I'd done all the fives drilling. I drilled through all the five. I started drilling through the fives the second time. Games in RC, I didn't need to
Yeah.
do
Sorry to
much.
interrupt there,
Go
but
ahead.
you mentioned you did all those tests, but not all of them as like 4-section practice tests. You're talking about
Yeah.
drilling time sections, splitting them up in that way.
So initially I just basically did drilling up until I from starting out till I was around the 170s. I just drilled a shit ton,
Oh
basically.
wow.
So I feel like it was a good fit for me. Take this also with a grain of salt. Another thing the Demon doesn't recommend. I now as a teacher, I only recommend it in specific circumstances. I did go through and drill each question type individually for an hour,
Hmm.
and I felt like that helped me see the patterns. So one thing I work with students on is with flaw questions, there's maybe between 5 and 10 kind of types of flaws that come up. In the lessons, we have some really explicit ones, right? Like correlation versus causation. Then I think there's these less like explicit ones kind of that either way, like there's these specific flaws that come up. And you start to notice, so like causation versus correlation, that's going to be the flaw and that's going to be the right answer on some questions. And then other questions, that's going to be one of the wrong answers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think true mastery looks for me, and this I also say this a lot about RC when you're talking about a tone question or a main point. I got to the point where the wrong answers I could be like, I know that's not the right answer because I just did another passage where that was the right answer, or I
Mm-hmm.
just did another flaw question where that was the flaw. And you really, really know what those flaws look like.
Yeah, there's a common question that I get from students. Well, I don't know how common it is, but I've definitely gotten the question from students, and you've probably seen this working on the Ask button, where a student will take a wrong answer and say, if the passage said this, would this be correct? Or if this answer choice was different in this little way, would this be correct? And that can, I think that can be helpful to imagine that scenario. Sometimes it can be confusing, but it sounds like that's what you're talking about, is recognizing, oh, I've seen the pattern for what makes this a correct answer, but that's not what I saw here.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And I agree. I do get those questions, and sometimes it could be a helpful exercise. Like sometimes I do that with my students, sometimes be like, okay, this one could be correct. But sometimes I get those ask buttons and it's just like, I'm sure you felt this too. It's just kind of impossible to make some of the answers. So I tell students, the wrong answers don't have to make sense. They're wrong. So they can be just complete and utter BS sometimes, right? So sometimes I see this, I think sometimes students are trying too hard to make a right answer correct. You know, they're like
Or
trying,
to
or
make a
even
wrong
trying too
answer
hard to make it
correct.
apply. They're trying
Yeah.
too hard to make it apply to the content. It doesn't even apply. So first start with asking yourself, does this even apply to the argument at all? And they're kind of forcing it to even fit into the world that's being built by the passage. So I can talk about this forever.
No,
We
this is exactly the LSAT nerd shit that I love. I it's way back in the Demon Daily archives at this point, but I had suggested a name for these particular answer choices at a certain point. I started identifying certain answer choices as what I called Escher answers, which, if you're familiar with the work of MC Escher, illustrator who drew these crazy architectural drawings of like staircases that went on forever or upside down, just like impossible geometry and that sort of stuff. They're really fascinating to look at because your brain tries to resolve them, but it can't. But you just get lost looking at this impossible piece of like geometry. And there's answer choices that are like that, where like your brain wants to resolve them and to explain them, but the whole point is that it can't do that. So you need to recognize that feeling and just walk away and not waste any more time on that wrong answer.
exactly. And
Yeah.
that's why the prediction is so important, right? Because you've got a good
Yes.
prediction. It's so much easier to see those answers versus if you're just trying. Those are the answers that screw you if you're just going in blind, not knowing what to look for. So,
Mm-hmm. You mentioned surprises and the fact that, after doing 60 practice tests and hours a day for months, you're really not getting surprised by this test anymore. Do you remember any surprises along the way, though? Anything that you really stuck out to you as like a big aha moment on the test, or even just something you learned about the way that you read or the way that you think?
I think there's actually a lot I could say. I think, a lot of people talked about games clicking and basically overnight going from sucking at games, getting -10 wrong, whatever, to perfect, like practically overnight. And I feel like I had that experience with all three in different ways. I definitely remember there was this moment where I was maybe around -7 consisting in RC, and then within a week I was down to -2 or
Mm.
-0. So, I think takeaway being, don't expect linear growth. Expect make a long-term plan for chipping away at it. And I think of like putting little piggies in the piggy bank, and then maybe once the piggy bank gets full, then you have I guess pennies in the piggy bank. Once it's full, then you have this big learning moment. You almost need to like build all this different stuff together and figure out how it works together in your brain to like get that improvement. So I think the patterns thing I talked about really was a big moment. I think learning to fight less was a big moment.
What do you mean by
I
that?
think I'd see this with so much on the ask button, just really trying to fight for wrong answers and be like, oh, I really thought this was right, and having a hard time letting go of that in review. There was a moment where I switched from trying to fight for my original view to immediately just being like, I was wrong. Why was I wrong? Almost, just almost slapping your like almost like self uh
Yeah,
pain or something. Like
sure.
just I don't know that not I could take it to an extreme analogy, but you get the idea. Like just really accepting when you're wrong and being like, okay, I was wrong. Why was I wrong? What am I gonna do different next time? That kind of mindset. With RC, there was a moment where I tell my students this all the time. I think the first thing is practicing. I view this as a skill, being able to read every sentence with your full attention and your full focus. That was a huge milestone because you can't do that. You just aren't you don't have to do that in your regular life.
Mm.
You just are never required to read every sentence of something with your full attention and carefully. And so that was a huge moment. And just noticing, like I said, noticing the patterns, like as I went was a huge moment. I also think some of this I've noticed more once I've started teaching, but I started just viewing everything straightforwardly as it was. I think when I was first practicing, I was experimenting with diagramming. I was experimenting with like swapping things out with variables like if A, then B, and that kind of thing. And at a certain point, I just gave all that up and I just read exactly what was on the page with the words that are on the page. I didn't like really try to swap out with other ideas. I didn't try to like swap it out for analogies and just read it straightforward. So, for instance, I think that really helps with if the conclusion is about what should happen, any answer that's about what should not happen is basically automatically wrong. You know what I mean?
Mm.
It's going to be really hard to construe that in a way that there's a right answer about what should not happen. If the
Yeah.
conclusion about what should happen, that's all we care about, right? So that kind of thinking and just viewing things straightforwardly, not trying to mix stuff up, helped a lot. I think that those are probably the main ones. I'm sure I could think of
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. And I think we both continue to learn more or see more or learn to articulate some of these lessons in different ways as we work with students. It's I'm amazed. I'm sure I'm a better LSAT student than I was when I took the LSAT, just because I've been teaching it for like 2 years now.
I'm still figuring out how I answered necessary, sufficient questions.
Hmm.
I think, in the sense that conditional reasoning, necessary and sufficient conditions versus necessary and sufficient assumptions. And I definitely had that kind of mixed up in my brain, and I'd kind of straighten it out and then I'd get it remixed up. And I think what I do is I notice, so for instance, there's a question about police, and there's two conditional statements, and one is about what's necessary to get a medal, and the other one's about what's sufficient to get a medal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in my head, I wouldn't be like, oh, this is the necessary condition, this is the sufficient condition. I'm just saying, this is what's telling us this is what's necessary to get a medal, this is what's sufficient to get a medal. And I would think about like necessary and sufficient in relation to what they're talking about in context. But I don't know. So, but like I said, you can tell I'm still kind of working through, how to teach that really well to students, and because I'm still working through how I did it in a way. I don't know.
Yeah.
That was a big surprise for me that I never really could explain it to myself how I was going about it in concrete terms.
Yeah. Well, speaking about, I'm just going to give you another opportunity to plug your reading comp class. You mentioned that it is a intro level or kind of introductory level reading comp class. But yeah.
It's Demon. It's two. There's a 6 week cycle, and there's 4 LR and 2 RC. So I do a
Ah,
little bit
okay.
of both. Yeah, but Demon Foundation, so super beginner level.
Cool. Anything in particular, like biggest lessons that you see repeating in those foundational level classes?
Definitely, I think every week I tell students to slow down. Also in my tutoring,
Yeah.
probably number one thing I'm saying. I see mindset stuff a lot. I think I'm always working with people on mindset. I think the number one advice I would give to somebody who's just starting out is, make a long-term plan and plan to be in it for the long haul. I think I spent about 300 hours studying, and I think a lot of people think, okay, I've got to apply in the fall, so maybe I'll start studying in August, and I'll take the test in September, and then I'll do my applications. And then they get trapped in this scenario where it's like, oh, well, I put myself on this timeline. I'd have to completely rechange my timeline to, study enough. Basically what I'm saying is if you're thinking about the bell curve of LSAT scores and 150 is the average and whatever percentage of people are getting 150s, I think the average person who's getting a 150 on an official test just doesn't realize how much time they need to study, and it probably doesn't have access to resources like the Demon or any kind of. I'm assuming there's a lot of people that just don't seek out test prep.
Mm.
So, you know, do invest in yourself. We always talk about, you know, even if you spend $1,000 on test prep, that's nothing compared to hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, right?
Yeah.
So, point being, plan to be in it for the long haul. Plan to spend some hours, and I can't tell you how many it's going to take. I think of the hours I spent, a lot of it was going for perfection. I will say. I think. On the other hand, I do think my teaching background stuff also made things go a little bit faster for me. Like especially for that first 171. Like I think I got there faster than I would have if I didn't have all this teaching experience and stuff. So I tell students like set a plan, set a goal of, okay, I'm going to study 50 quality hours. Make sure they're quality and make sure you're doing the right thing, which that's, what we're help with. We're help you like make sure your setting is effective. Plan to study 50 hours. That's like an hour a day for 2 months. If you're working full time, an hour a day is excellent. If you can do that and then see where you're at. Like I would think the average person with 50 hours might go up a couple points on average. It's going to vary, but it's going to give you an idea like, okay, like if I want to go up 15 points, I'm probably going to need 200, 300 hours, whatever it may be.
Mm.
But if you commit yourself to that, like, okay, I'm going to study 250 hours. I'm going to do an hour a day, whatever it is, however you need to get there. And you just like commit, like, I am going to do this, like 100%. Then I think that's what you need to get there.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Brandon, thanks so much. This has been a treat.
Of course. Thanks for having me. I love talking about this stuff. And like we said, come pop in my class if you got questions. Sometimes I like I said, those motivation classes are the last one I did, the next one I'm doing are free. So feel free to come to those if you're listening and want to ask me something.
Email daily@lsatdemon.com if you'd like to ask us a question or share some LSAT or law school admissions news. Thanks for listening.